In the summer of approximately 10 CE, in a courtyard in Nazareth, Mary was preserving food for winter. Not canning, cans were 1,700 years away. Not freezing, electricity was 1,900 years away. Not salting primarily, salt was expensive and scarce. Not in jars with sealed lids. The rubber seal was 1,800 years away. She was using something simpler than any of those things. Something that required no equipment that her household didn't already have. Something that had been used by every family in Galilee for 1,000 years before her. And the food she preserved that summer fed her household: Joseph, Jesus, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and her daughters. From October through April, 7 months, without spoilage, without refrigeration, without a single modern convenience. The method she used is so simple that when you hear it, your first reaction will be, "That can't work." Your second reaction will be to try it. And when you do, you will understand why every civilization on Earth, independently and simultaneously, arrived at the same technique. It is not a trick. It is chemistry. And it has been running quietly in human kitchens for 10,000 years. Before refrigeration, the fundamental problem of food was not production. It was time. You could produce food in abundance during the harvest season. The question that determined whether your family survived was whether you could extend that abundance beyond the season that produced it. In 1st century Galilee, the harvest calendar created two distinct periods: abundance and scarcity. From April through November, grain harvest, fig harvest, grape harvest, olive harvest. The food supply was at its richest. From December through March, cold, wet, no harvest. The stores being drawn down, survival depended entirely on what had been preserved from the abundance months. The gap between the harvest peak and the hunger floor was the gap that preservation had to bridge. And in a household that might contain 7 to 15 people, the volume of food that needed to be preserved was substantial. Mary was not an exception. She was doing what every woman in Nazareth was doing, every woman in every village in Galilee, what her mother had done and her grandmother before that. The primary preservation method was not what most people think when they imagine ancient food storage. It was not primarily salting or drying. It was fermentation. Controlled, specific, intentional fermentation. The deliberate creation of lactic acid environments that were chemically hostile to the microorganisms that spoil food, while simultaneously friendly to the microorganisms that preserve it. Mary did not know the chemistry. She knew the method, and the method worked. The method is this: take any vegetable, olives, cucumbers, turnips, wild greens, onions, beets. Submerge it completely in water. Add nothing else. Leave it in a cool, dark place. Within 24 to 48 hours, the lactobacillus bacteria naturally present on the surface of the vegetable and in the environment begin to consume the natural sugars in the vegetable and produce lactic acid as a byproduct. The lactic acid drops the pH of the brine. As the pH drops, it creates an environment in which pathogenic bacteria, the ones that cause food spoilage, the ones that cause illness, cannot survive. They are chemically excluded from the environment by the very product of the fermentation process. Meanwhile, the lactobacillus bacteria that produce the lactic acid are highly acid tolerant. They continue to thrive in the increasingly acidic brine, continuing to produce more lactic acid, which continues to lower the pH, which continues to exclude pathogens until the fermentation reaches a stable equilibrium. At that point, the vegetable in the brine will keep. For months, at room temperature, with no intervention, no energy input, no technology beyond a clay vessel and water. This is sauerkraut. This is kimchi. This is the preserved olive that the ancient Israelites ate at every meal. This is the process that allowed Mary to take the olive harvest of October and turn it into a 12-month food supply. The vessels were not sealed. They were covered loosely, a cloth, a stone, to keep insects out while allowing the carbon dioxide produced by fermentation to escape. The brine self-maintained. If a vegetable floated above the brine surface and was exposed to air, it might develop surface mold that was scooped off. The vegetable below the brine surface was protected by the acidic environment. No jars, no lids, no salt required in sufficient quantities to be prohibitive. Just a vessel, water, time, and the bacteria that are already everywhere. The preservation calendar of the ancient Galilean household followed the harvest calendar with precision. Each food had its season, its preparation window, and its method. October, the olive harvest. This was the most labor-intensive preservation task of the year. Fresh olives are inedible. They contain a bitter compound called oleuropein that must be leached out before the olive is palatable. The ancient method: crush the olives slightly to break the skin, then submerge them in fresh water. Change daily for the first week, then weekly, for a period of 2 to 4 weeks until the bitterness has leached out. Then transfer to a brine of water or water with a small amount of salt if available, and allow to ferment for an additional 2 to 4 weeks. The result was a lactic acid fermented olive that would keep for 12 months in the brine. Every meal, every day, the household ate fermented olives alongside their bread. Not because they liked the taste, though they did, but because fermented olives were a calorie-dense, mineral-rich, probiotic-loaded food that was available 12 months a year from a single October harvest. Late summer, wild greens and vegetables. Whatever the household could gather or grow, wild chicory, dandelion, mustard greens, onions, leeks, was fermented in water brine during the abundance months and stored for the lean months. In a world without refrigeration, fresh vegetables were available for approximately 4 months of the year. Fermented vegetables extended that access to 12 months. August and September, figs, the primary sweet food of the ancient diet. Fresh figs fermented spontaneously. They are heavily colonized by wild yeast on their surface. The fig honey mentioned in ancient sources was the product of figs allowed to partially ferment, their sugars converting to a thick, complex, sweet liquid. Long-term preservation was primarily by drying, but short-term, weeks to a few months. Fermentation in honey or in their own juices extended the fig harvest significantly. Year-round, milk into yogurt and cheese. In a household without refrigeration, fresh milk from the family's goats or sheep had to be processed within hours. Fermentation into yogurt, into soft cheese, extended the usable life from hours to weeks or months. The whey produced by cheesemaking was not discarded. It was used in bread, in soup, in grain cooking. Nothing was wasted. The technology was the clay vessel, and it is more sophisticated than it looks. The ceramic tradition of ancient Israel produced vessels specifically designed for fermentation and storage. The shapes were not arbitrary. They were functional responses to the physics of fermentation and storage. The large storage jar, the pithos, had a narrow neck that limited surface exposure to the air, reducing the risk of oxidative spoilage while allowing fermentation gases to escape. The base was often rounded, not flat. This made the jar easier to rock when mixing and impossible to sit upright without being sunk partially into the ground, which provided the geothermal cooling that extended storage life. Clay is porous. This is not a flaw. In a fermentation vessel, porosity allows a microscopic exchange of gases through the vessel wall, preventing the pressure buildup that would eventually break a sealed container. Clay vessels breathe. The fermentation inside them proceeds at a stable rate because the environment is never completely sealed. The specific mineral composition of the clay mattered. Clay from different geological sources contained different mineral profiles that leached into the food in contact with them over long periods. Archaeological analysis of mineral content in food stored in ancient clay vessels has found elevated calcium, magnesium, and potassium, minerals that leached from the clay into the brine and were consumed as part of the food. The clay vessel was not a neutral container. It was an active participant in the nutrition of the food it held. When we replaced clay with glass, then plastic, materials that do not breathe, do not leach minerals, do not participate in the chemistry of the food they contain. We removed an element of the food system that we have not adequately studied or replaced. The food tasted different. The food preserved differently. The food may have been nutritionally different. Mary was not preserving food for its health benefits. She was preserving food for survival. But what she was doing to the food in the process of preserving it was, by any modern nutritional analysis, making it more nutritious than when she started. This is the counterintuitive truth about fermentation. It is not just a preservation method. It is a nutritional enhancement method. When lactobacillus bacteria ferment vegetables, they produce B vitamins as metabolic byproducts, particularly folate, riboflavin, and B12 in some cases. A fermented vegetable that started with modest B vitamin content ends up with more B vitamins than it began with. The bacteria are producing them. Fermentation degrades oxalic acid in leafy greens, the compound that binds calcium and prevents its absorption. Fermented spinach is more calcium bioavailable than raw or cooked spinach. The same process that makes it safe to store makes it more nutritious to eat. The lactobacillus bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids during fermentation, particularly butyrate, which is the primary energy substrate for the cells lining the colon. A diet rich in fermented foods is a diet that continuously feeds and maintains the gut lining. The gut lining, the barrier between the contents of the intestine and the bloodstream, is the primary defense against systemic inflammation. Mary's fermented olives were probiotic. Her fermented greens were prebiotic and mineral enhanced. Her yogurt and cheese were dense sources of complete protein and bioavailable calcium. Every element of her preservation practice was simultaneously a nutritional enhancement practice. She did not know this. She knew that the food was good and that her household stayed healthy. She knew the method worked. The mechanism was invisible to her. The mechanism is visible to us now, and it points directly at what we are missing. You do not need clay vessels. You do not need a courtyard in Galilee. You need a glass jar, water, and vegetables. Here is the simplest entry point. Take any hard vegetable, a small cucumber, a turnip, a carrot, a handful of green beans. Wash it, but do not scrub it. You want the bacteria on the surface. Place it in a clean glass jar. Cover with water. That is it. No salt. Mary's method, the water-only brine method, works without salt. The lactobacillus bacteria on the vegetable surface need no salt to begin their work. Salt is added in some traditions to slow the fermentation and select for specific bacterial strains, but it is not required. Place a small stone or a folded leaf over the top of the vegetables to keep them submerged. Cover the jar with a cloth secured with a rubber band, not a lid. The cloth allows CO2 to escape while keeping insects out. Leave at room temperature, ideally between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius. Within 24 hours, you will see small bubbles rising from the bottom of the jar. This is the CO2 produced by fermentation. The process has begun. Taste daily from day 2 onward. The vegetable will become progressively more sour as the lactic acid concentration builds. When the sourness reaches a level you find pleasant, typically between 3 and 7 days, move the jar to the refrigerator. Cold temperatures slow the fermentation without stopping it. The vegetable will keep for months. The brine is as valuable as the vegetable. Drink a tablespoon of it daily. The brine is a concentrated probiotic liquid, dense with live lactobacillus bacteria and the postbiotic compounds they have produced during fermentation. This is Mary's method, in your kitchen, in a glass jar. Starting tonight, the fermentation vessels in Mary's courtyard were always active. There was never a time when something was not fermenting, not transforming, not being preserved for the months when the harvest would not provide. This continuous practice, the daily management of multiple fermentation processes, the monitoring of each vessel, the transfer of the preserved food to the storage chamber at the right moment, was not a hobby. It was the infrastructure of the household's survival. And it produced something beyond mere survival. It produced a household whose gut microbiome was continuously replenished by diverse probiotic organisms from multiple fermented food sources: olives, yogurt, cheese, fermented greens, sourdough bread. A household whose immune system was continuously trained by the diversity of organisms it encountered. A household that had, encoded in its daily food practice, the protection against inflammatory disease that we are now spending billions of dollars in pharmaceutical research trying to recreate. The pharmaceutical industry calls them probiotics. Mary called them olives. The research industry calls them postbiotics. Mary called them brine. The functional medicine movement calls it the gut-brain axis. Mary called it knowing that when her children were sick, she gave them a cup of warm fermented whey, and they improved. She was not practicing medicine. She was practicing the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of mothers who had noticed the same things she was noticing. The wisdom is available to you. Tonight, in a glass jar, with a cucumber and water. Fill a jar tonight. A cucumber, a carrot, a handful of whatever vegetable is in your refrigerator. Cover it with water. Put a cloth over the top. Leave it on your counter for 3 days. Taste it on day 2. You will taste something your gut recognizes as real food in a way that almost nothing in a grocery store can replicate. Because it is real. It is alive. It is the oldest food preservation method in the world, and it is the most nutritionally sophisticated. If this changed how you think about what preservation is and what it does to food, share it tonight. Subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments, have you ever made fermented vegetables? Do you keep a jar going on your counter? Drop it below. I'll see you in the next one.